Scott Phillips, you're the CEO of Passages. Thank you for joining us on Jerusalem Dateline.
Always good to be with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, you've been talking about some surveys, recent surveys of Gen Z, and some disturbing facts. Tell us what that's all about.
Well, I think what we're seeing is more and more young people, young Christians particularly, have less and less of a biblical worldview and have less and less biblical knowledge, particularly Gen Z. You see a recent survey out, I believe it's by Barna, that says, only 4% of Gen Z have a biblical worldview. And that's down, from 6% from a previous generation, 8% from a previous generation before that. And so I think what you're seeing is just an unfamiliarization with the Bible, I think, which can create theological issues, which can create maybe a distorted view of the Bible and God's story.
Yeah, I know there was another survey that also talked about 40% of that generation thought, yeah, Jesus is just like me, he sinned too. What do you think is behind all this lack of knowledge of the Bible?
Well, and that's a great question. And I think that particular, my theory on why people may have think Jesus sinned is because they have a lack of Bible knowledge. They have a lack of the story of the Bible. They have a lack of the understanding of why Jesus would even come, that he had to be sinless in order to be the sacrifice for our sins, which Christianity is built on. But I think a lot of that comes from a lack of knowing the Bible and knowing its full story.
So what do you think we could do about that?
Well, that's also a good question. I think that, this generation, it's a wonderful generation. I mean, there's so much promise, so much potential, so much calling. And I think that this generation, they want authenticity and they want to touch, they want to feel, they want something tangible. And of course, sometimes faith can't be tangible, but we do have a place called Israel. We have a place called the Holy Land. And we know that these are the places where many stories in the Bible took place, where many of these characters that we've read about, many of these stories, God's ultimate redemptive story unfolded mostly in the land of Israel. And so I think for them to be able to go there, to touch it, to feel it, to put it with the stories of the Bible, and also have someone help them along and show them, okay, Abraham, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the kings, the prophets, ultimately point to Jesus. And then the disciples took that message to the nations. And for them to understand that full redemption of why Jesus had to come, he didn't come out of a vacuum. He was born in the land of Israel. He was a Jew. So Christianity was born out of the Hebrew scriptures, out of Judaism. And that's important to understand why he even came and why he had to die on the cross, why he had to be a sacrifice for our sins. And so I think if they can come see it and put the stories together in the ultimate redemptive narrative, touch, feel it, and know that it's a tangible thing, that it was real. We hear that time and time again with our students.
Tell me, perhaps, what are some of the things you have seen? Students that have come here and had a revelation. Maybe tell me a story or two about that.
Absolutely. I just read a testimony yesterday from a student that came to Israel this summer. And, they say that, they said that their faith was struggling, that they didn't know if it was real. They couldn't put it together that it was reality. But when they were able to come and actually see these places, to see where Jesus walked, to go to the Garden of Gethsemane and have that moment where they're reading in the scriptures where Jesus had his last hours on earth, and then they're looking up at these olive trees and they're looking up at the old city of Jerusalem. And that's an incredible moment for them, that aha moment. I had a personal experience. I grew up in the church. I grew up believing. I came to know Jesus at a young age, had amazing encounters with God at a young age. And still, my mind had a hard time, is Jesus who he said he was? My first trip to Israel in 2005, out on the Sea of Galilee, out on a dock, looking up at the stars. At that point was my journey to really knowing. And that was really just because I could tangibly be in this place and put these stories together.
So how many people you think Passages will bring this year?
This year we're going to bring.
It looks like COVID
this year we're going to bring
now, and
yes, absolutely. COVID is hopefully behind us now. I think it is. And last year we were able to, sneak 500 students in the country during the opening and closings of the border. This year, it's 1,500. Next year, we're hoping for, around 2,500 students to come to Israel.
Wow. And how do they get involved with Passages?
Yeah, so many times we work with partners on campuses across the U.S. They recruit students, but also those students who are not part of one of our partner schools can just go to our website at passagesisrael.org and apply for a trip. And it's highly scholarshiped. There are a lot of scholarships available for this trip.
Okay, that's great. So anything you'd like to add, Scott?
I think this was a great discussion. And I think that, if we can just get more and more next generation Christian leaders over to the land where their faith was born so they can just encounter their spiritual heritage and get in touch with those deep roots, I think we're going to have a firmly rooted next generation of Christian leaders. And so, anybody that wants to learn more about Passages, support Passages, apply for a Passages trip can go to our website, passagesisrael.org.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.